All right, let's get into the news. The big item today is the passing of Paul Orndorff, a very notable figure in professional wrestling history, of course. One of the headliners of the very first WrestleMania, and someone that had, an exceptional athletic career before he got into professional wrestling. This was someone, he was born in Virginia, but was raised in around Brandon, Florida, and he became like a major football star in high school and then playing for the University of Tampa. He was a fullback, and then in university, he actually got moved positions, but he was, an extraordinary athlete just in not just football, but also he excelled in track. He was drafted by the New Orleans Saints, and then later had a cup of coffee in the Chicago Bears camp. Neither of those resulted in spots on the teams, so he never did play in the NFL. But that was kind of his exit from football after those camps, and then went into professional wrestling. And he was in Florida and got hooked up with Eddie Graham, who was the dominant promoter in Florida, and that's where Paul Orndorff went. And he was kind of just thrown in there with the likes of Bob Backlund, Jack Briscoe, Bob Roop, Hiro Matsuda, and trained for about 8 months and then went into working. He started out in Florida, and this is all pre-WWF, where he had substantial runs wrestling in Memphis. He went to St. Louis. He formed a tag team with Jimmy Snuka in Mid-Atlantic, and of course, Jimmy Snuka would also be part of that WrestleMania main event. Went to Georgia Championship Wrestling. A lot of people will be familiar with his time because it was pretty lengthy in Mid-South, wrestling for Bill Watts. It was here that he headlined several of Mid-South would peak their shows for the Louisiana Superdome, where he headlined several of those dome shows, including lights out matches with Ernie Ladd, with Junkyard Dog, and stayed with Mid-South pretty much from 78 till around the middle of 1982. And then right before going to the WWF, he had a brief stop in Kansas City for Central States. So by the time he gets to WWF, which is around the tail end of 1983, he's already 34 years old. And that was a big factor as well. When Vince McMahon was expanding nationally, a lot of it was, he was getting tapes from other promoters, and they were sending, footage of like their big stars. And then McMahon would pluck these big stars and kind of just taking from all these territories. But what you had was this amalgamation of all of these kind of seasoned performers that had headlined in different territories, all coming to the WWF under that umbrella, and Hulk Hogan leading the charge. So Orndorff was right off the bat a pretty significant heel in the company. He was aligned with Roddy Piper, who they had kind of designated as a manager when he came over from Mid-Atlantic. This was after the Starrcade match with Greg Valentine. They kind of saw Piper in more of a managerial role, and then would eventually become, the heel that everyone remembers during that run. But throughout 1984, Orndorff was involved in all of the buildup, the stuff involving Piper and Cyndi Lauper. He was right there attached at the hip, and that leads to WrestleMania I, where it's Hulk Hogan and Mr. T defeating Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper. And it was a very important show for the company. It was across the country on closed circuit. They did about 400,000 tickets sold on closed circuit. So it ended up doing very well with that last week push. But they also canceled like a lot of locations that were carrying WrestleMania. It was a very important show. They had staked a ton on the success of that show. And it was sort of in those last a couple of days in the lead up with the promotion of Mr. T and Hogan that made it into a very successful show. And after WrestleMania I, that's when Orndorff is shifted over as a babyface. He's kind of blamed. He's the one that takes the fall in the match. And then his next heel turn is the one that his career, in my opinion, was defined by. And that's the run he has with Hogan. He does the big turn on Hogan, and they end up having this incredible house show program. And Paul Orndorff becomes one of the best drawing opponents of Hogan's career. It was a while back, we did a Rewind Away looking at the big event, and that was an enormous success for the company. They promoted it with the CNE here in Toronto. And this was a show that just grew and grew and grew. And by the end, it was 61,000 paid, 64,000 people in attendance. And this was largely a glorified house show, just taking that Hogan Orndorff program from TV and going to all the major cities with it. And here in Toronto, it was an enormous success. And Matt Farmer, who's both a promoter and a historian, noted today that within a 7-day period, that Hogan Orndorff program drew 150,000 people, including that Toronto show. Like, they took it. They went to Chicago. They went to Riverfront Stadium, I believe. I have the list in my update today, but it was just a red hot program. And back in the 80s, this was the formula they would do, was take the main event to all the different towns, and then you'd blow it off by putting it on TV. And that's where they did the Saturday night's main event, which aired right at the beginning of 87. And you finish that program by airing it on NBC. And then Hogan was off to Andre for WrestleMania III. But the program, it's both going to be Orndorff's most remembered for good and bad. It drew incredibly, but in the midst of that stretch, he has a neck injury and just worked his way through it. And that's where his right arm started to atrophy. And that was, unfortunately, a stark reminder of what he put his body through during that stretch. He's making this incredible money and just didn't want to take himself off the road. But you could see in future photos how the difference in his arm size as a result of that and not taking care of it. Like, it was, a real big warning sign of, performers of, what the trade-off was when you're drawing on top with Hulk Hogan, the biggest star. It's very hard to take if the company isn't stepping in to take you out of that, it's kind of left on you. And that's a very difficult choice to make. So the WWF run lasts until 88. He bounces around all over the place, but like the last significant run was in WCW that started in the early 90s. He had a television title run, several tag title runs with Paul Roma. They actually feuded with Bagwell and the Patriot, who we just talked about when he passed away 2 weeks ago, and kind of winds down his career and then transitions into a role as both a road agent and then later training at the power plant. He had that big fight with Big Van Vader that was a pretty big story at the time in 95. This was when Vader allegedly just being pretty arrogant about just taking instruction, and it led to this famous story that's been retold by everyone involved who was back there. But Orndorff got struck by Vader, and Orndorff came back and just like beat the hell out of this guy in flip-flops, and it ended up leading to Vader leaving the company. Vader's side of the story was that they wanted to work out a fine and a suspension, and he ended up walking out on his own. Eric Bischoff is very adamant. He said, no, he was fired, and that was it. There was no negotiation over anything. He was fired, and that's when he goes to the WWF. But Orndorff stays in WCW and had that. They did bring him back several times for matches, including the last one, which was Fall Brawl in 2000. And this was, I remember watching this. This was in Buffalo, New York, and Orndorff, he's trained all the natural born thrillers, or at least worked with them in the power plant. So I guess they felt, there's a story here. This guy's familiar with all these guys, and he goes to execute a pile driver. I think it's on Mike Sanders, but regardless. And his neck, who, of course, he's had the problems with in the past, he just has essentially, like, his neck is messed, and he cannot lift Sanders. And they call the match off. It's done. And that was the end. WCW was not going to have Orndorff wrestle any longer. And then his post-wrestling career, he went into the Hall of Fame for the WWE. He went into several of the major Hall of Fames out there. He did a cameo with they got all the WrestleMania headliners together for that show, The Year in New Orleans, which was, it was very appropriate because the Superdome was where Orndorff had a lot of big matches, and that's where they brought all of them together that year that Hogan opened the show with Austin and The Rock, and then did some cameos on WWE TV. And then sadly, it's been, a lot of unfortunate health updates regarding Orndorff. He battled cancer about a decade ago, and then, had just been in declining health. A lot of memory issues. He was part of that concussion lawsuit against the WWE. Several weeks ago, his son had posted that unfortunate video of just the state that Orndorff was in. And he had two sons, one of whom Travis announced his passing this morning, but 71 years old. And I think someone that I just don't know if it's someone that, there's a lot of history attached to him.
Yeah, for me personally, I mean, I started watching wrestling kind of after he had his prime. I remember really only being familiar with him through his WCW run. So he's a name who wasn't necessarily big enough to have to have really any significant documentary or DVD made about him, or even a TV special.
He never got the WWE treatment, which to this generation, that is a factor of the stars that they tell that history with. Like Orndorff never got the DVD treatment. He did go in the Hall of Fame. They brought him in for Raw one year for Hogan's birthday, but he never got to be one of those big, like a Piper, for instance. Like he was never presented under that light. So I think that this week, there's probably a lot of younger people that are going to learn a lot about Paul Orndorff.
Yeah, myself included. So thank you for dedicating that time and that research. You can read all of those notes from John's recap on postwrestling.com from today.
Who was the guy he did that awful skit with in WCW? Was the name Gary Spivey? Was that it? Do you remember this?
You are asking the wrong person. I don't remember. Some Professor Kevin says yes in the chat room.
That is what instantly comes to mind of the early or mid WCW run with Paul Orndorff. It was he was on the Law once, and it was not a great interview, but I always remembered this answer because it was apropos of kind of the time period of some wrestlers with this mindset. It was Merrick who was doing the interview, and the question was, Paul, who was the toughest guy you ever worked with? And before he even gets the question out, Paul's just, myself. And Jeff says, besides yourself, Paul. And there's this long pause. I can't answer that. And it was like the guy, it really tells you like the mindset of like some of those performers. It was like, was not going to give an inch. It was like, I was the toughest guy in the room. No, and dude, Paul Orndorff was a really tough guy. Like the Vader story was proof positive of that for a lot of people. But it was
you don't mess with a man in flip flops, man.
No,
Never.
no. As Kevin Nash said today, the toughest man in flip flops, Paul Orndorff. And he always made sure to include that in the story. I was wearing flip flops. Anyway, so rest in peace, Paul Orndorff. 71 is still young and unfortunate. The nature of like what he was suffering from, like you really worry about that. I think long term when people will criticize us when we're constantly bringing up headshots and stuff like that. It's a reason. There's a reason for that we're not going to see the effects next week. It's years and decades from now. The compound nature of this. I watch some of the stuff with like Masa Kitamiya in Japan. It's where you're just drilling these guys in the head, and it's Shibata was a really scary one because the effects were instant, but it's the accumulation that just adds up over time. It's definitely concerning. And I hope that there's a lot of like the younger wrestlers now that I think like that's gotten through, like shots to the head and stuff like that. And it's not like Paul Orndorff was a guy who was, nailing himself in the head every week, but it's just the impact. It's all of this stuff that you hope that this is something that is not going to be seen in a lot of guys, but we have seen it in quite a number of older ex-wrestlers.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that it kind of takes events like this for us to be reminded of the fragility of the human body. But if there's a silver lining, it's that it's a reminder of everybody in this business to take care of themselves.